Welcome to the fourth Durham Castle Lecture, and I'm delighted that Conor Gearty has been able to brave the weather to join us this evening, and I'm also very pleased that you've all managed to come. It's quite a bitter evening, and it's great to have an audience for Conor. Conor is, I'll depart from my text, he is simply one of the most passionate academics and witty human beings I've come across in 30 years of being in academic life. And if you're an academic, you don't come across many really passionate academics who are witty as well. And so it's a great pleasure to know him, and it's a great pleasure to have him here. I've known Conor for a number of years, maybe 10 since we both arrived at the LSE. It's a great pleasure to welcome him here. He'll speak to the theme this evening of liberty and security for all, question mark. And this reflects his long-standing interests, research interests in the intersection of civil liberties, terrorism, and human rights. Conor is Professor of Human Rights Law at the LSE. From 2002 to 2009, he was Director of the Centre for the Study of Human Rights. Born in Ireland, he graduated from University College Dublin before moving to Cambridge, where he took a master's and a PhD. His first appointment was as a fellow at Emmanuel College, Cambridge. In 1990, he moved to the School of Law at King's College, London, where he became a professor. And then later, in 2002, you joined the LSE. Conor is also a practicing barrister with the Matrix Chamber. The lecture tonight is based on Conor's new book, Liberty and Security, published by Polity, out now. And next week, and available in all good bookshops, and of course through Amazon. And a slight clash of interest here, so since some of you know I moonlight as a publisher, Polity happens to be it. So I have obviously a stake in the success of this book. But even if I didn't have a stake in the success of this book, it is a really lucid, compelling account of these rather pressing issues. But having said all that, please join with me in giving Conor the deservedly warm welcome he should enjoy. The book. Damaged the equipment already. The book. I wonder whether it's high enough. Is it right? Yeah, I think that'll be all right. The book is rather short. It has very large print, and contained within it, remarkably, contained within it, like that book by Dan Brown, are clues to first-year exams in Durham University. And it's a complicated system. I won't go into it now, but you can crack the code, and there is a collection of model answers to questions. So this is a steal. This is a steal. And it's also possible to email me. You'll have already forgotten my name, and I'm surrounded by various ancient colonial and religious emperors, including Charles Thorpe, D.D., so I don't have a banner behind me with my name. My name is Conor Gearty. Email me, and I have a form on my computer at home, which is called Author Discount Form. And you can get, I think it's as much as £2.99, knocked off the already absurdly cheap book. It really is absurdly cheap. Now, I have found yet no way of cutting him out of the deal, because we can cut the bookshops out of the deal. But there he is, the commercial emperor, who has made it indispensable so far as his own stream is concerned. So I can't offer it on a special David held free, but I can offer it nearly free. So thank you very much for the invitation. And I love coming up to Durham, actually. The Durham Law Department is where I usually visit. They are mainly, I have to say, extremely hostile to me. It is, as you know, run by a cabal of extremely aggressive judicial obsessives. If you are law students, you will know that they think everything that the judge does is right,
and that the most important thing in the world is to get a judge to visit Durham University. So every now and again, you'll bump into some middle-aged white man, rather like myself, and he will announce how interesting it is to meet students, and that'll be a judge. And I have taken a different view over time about these people, and it has led to tremendous activity, both during the speeches that I've given here, and particularly, it has to be said, looking over at Roger Masterman, after them. So I've really enjoyed it. I really enjoy coming here, and I'm looking forward to some aggressive remarks from you all later. But I do want to thank David Held. You're very lucky. I know if you guys are at Durham University, it's LSE's loss is very much Durham's gain. And you're very lucky to have David, who was a colleague of mine, as he was saying, for many years, and actually has produced some output which is really remarkable in that he can speak to people outside his own field. That is regarded by all of us as very superstitious, as very suspicious. We're very anxious about people who can communicate to other departments. And actually writes about contemporary issues that strike us as important. And that's also another source of deep suspicion in the world of academia. And his books are bought. And that is another source of great suspicion in the world of academia. And all of these things, which are sources of suspicion in others, are sources of celebration, as far as I'm concerned, and would that there were more academics like David Held. So it's delightful for me to be invited here to speak, and I'm very grateful. Now, this lecture, I'm not going to go on too long. You're very, very far away, so my temptation is to sort of think of you as not here and witter on and on. And I believe in a more immediate audience as a way of compelling the speaker to be mindful of the negative impact that the speaker is having on those around him. These people on the wall being dead or indifferent, but you guys are very much alive. So what I'm going to do, this is the deal. I'm going to talk about liberty and security for all. And I'm going to talk, I have no watch. That's another slight concern. I have no watch at all, and I'm not even sure if the date, so bring a sleeping bag. But David will at some point, if he judges I've gone on too much, as he was beginning to do when I was talking about him, will sort of look at me quite severely, David, if you don't mind. And I will, having rejected it once or twice, eventually succumb. I intend to speak for no more than about 40 to 45 minutes. But I'm going to take my time at the start because I've got a slightly complicated argument, and if I rush it, I won't follow it, and therefore it's probable you won't follow it. There could be some incredible accident where I don't follow it and you follow it. That sometimes happens, but I'm not going to take the risk. If I follow it, there's a chance that you will follow it. And what I'll be doing is setting up a discussion about liberty and security. And I'm going to introduce it by explaining what gave me the idea for this book, Liberty and Security for All. And it was the mystery of how political leaders, whom I thought should be ashamed and embarrassed to raise the issue of liberty, seemed proud to speak of little else. And how this pride was not bad faith pride, but was rooted in a genuine belief shared by others that they were promoters of that important value, liberty, despite the evidence that I thought was overwhelmingly to the contrary. I thought, how can this happen? And the two examples I'm going to give just by way of introduction before I give you the basic structure of the lecture are the examples of George Bush. I think we still have to call him Jr. Somehow or another, strikes me as quite appropriate. And Gordon Brown, very much senior. Think about George W. Bush. It's January 2005. This guy has been responsible for, as commander-in-chief, invasions, which are to be deplored in my opinion, but off the point here, more to the point, been responsible for detention without charge in Guantanamo and many other places. This is a person who has overseen on his watch irrefutable evidence of systemic torture, inhuman and degrading treatment of foreigners, but more to the point, a person who has overseen vast invasions of the civil liberties of Americans. And with the Patriot Act, with extraordinary revelations about how he, as commander-in-chief, was going outside the law to telephone tap anyway, how they were deploying the immigration laws to prevent people from leaving America for months on end, and material witnesses programs which are depriving people of freedom for months, indeed years on end. This is a man who devoted his second inaugural to the issue of freedom. And he wasn't, as they say in vulgar parlance, having a laugh. This is what he said. There is a moral choice between oppression, which is always wrong, and freedom, which is eternally right. And a bit later on, the survival, this is a direct quote, of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands. The best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all the world. And then this is his inaugural. This is no sort of put together after dinner speech. Some I know have questioned the global appeal of liberty. Though this time in history, 4 decades defined by the swiftest advance of freedom ever seen, is an odd time for doubt. Americans, of all people, should never be surprised by the power of our ideals. And here's the sentence I want to draw attention to. Eventually, the call of freedom comes to every mind and every soul. And then a bit later on, liberty will come to those who love it. So it's a speech about liberty, and it's well-meaning, you know. I mean, he's not giggling before he goes in there saying, I'm going to just pull the wool over the Americans' eyes. He believes it, and listeners believe it. And we go on, the liberal progressives, about Bush v. Gore in 2000. There was no Bush v. Gore in 2004. This is a popular president. And compared with, say, Gordon Brown, 2007. He's taken over. He's the new PM. He has been a key member of a government that has also engaged in what I believe to have been an unlawful invasion of another country. He is a person who has been in the cabinet that has authorized indefinite detention of suspected international terrorists, bracket, foreign terrorists, close bracket, until it was struck down by the courts, and has overseen systems of control orders, which are not overseen, but been part of a cabinet which has agreed the most extraordinary attacks on liberty. He's a member of the government, key member of the government, that proposed long-term detention before charge in the run-up, as I recall. Fiona DeAndres is here and knows all about it, will remind us maybe if she wants to, in the run-up to the 2005 election. And he says in this speech in October 2007, he's just taken over, he gives it on liberty too. There is a distinctively British interpretation of liberty, one that asserts the importance of freedom from prejudice, of rights to privacy, and of limits to the scope of arbitrary state power. So let's assume again, like George Bush, he's not having a laugh, he's not cynical, he believes it. There's something going on here, which means that these men can see no inconsistency between the sets of actions and decisions in which they are participating and the rhetorical commitment to liberty for all. And then you see the subject, the article, this lecture by Gordon Brown on liberty quickly becomes a lecture on security. And the two are absolutely connected. Because we love liberty, we have to protect our security. And this is the way Gordon Brown puts it. Terrorism can strike anywhere and anytime, with the very freedoms we have built up over generations being the freedoms most terrorists want to destroy. And so what happens is a lecture which is on liberty ends up being an argument for extended pre-charge detention. And so the lecture changes tone, and it becomes another one of those lectures where we're being told by the government that it's essential to lock people up without charge. Now, I've already flagged this up, and I'm just saying it, and I'm saying it slowly at the start, so forgive me, but there is something going on here about the meanings of liberty and security, these two words. And I want to explore with you what that thing is that is going on. And my goal is to explain it. And to explain it in a non-cynical way. And that's actually spookier than saying it's cynical. Because, and this is what this book, don't forget the author discount form, £11.99. This book is trying to say is that we are moving into a different kind of political structure worldwide, most places now. Even China's putting its toe in the water of what I'm describing some years away, but they'll get there when they realize how unpainful it is. We're moving to a new kind of political structure, which I call in the book neo-democracy. And so the way I'm going to develop the argument now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the past, and that's a kind of slightly complicated but slightly boring bit, but it's very important. And then I'm going to talk about the present, by which I mean what's been happening since 1989. And then I'm going to talk right at the end, if I'm allowed by David, about the future and what we do about the future. And I'll be interested in the Q&A about the future. The past, part 1 of 3. Well, I came here last year and I talked about Thomas Hobbes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about him again, because last year was where I was testing out some of these ideas in the law department. But I want to put together two rival views of liberty and security. And you could start way back in the ancients, but I'm starting with the 17th century. And I'm going to give you two rival visions of liberty and security, which I hope you can remember and follow. One is the vision promoted by Thomas Hobbes, this big 17th century guy, big intellectual in England. And the other is the vision of liberty promoted at the same time by a community of radicals and progressives called the Levelers. So these guys start the discussion about what liberty and security mean, which has given us the kind of vocabulary, and by us I mean sort of the West, the Anglo-American cultural political tradition, with which to describe liberty and security. And they are radically different. And they help explain Brown-Blair, or Brown-Bush. So let's take Hobbes first. You probably know your Hobbes. Hobbes is a big man on liberty and a big man on security. His very first work, Elements of Law, what's liberty? Liberty, and this guy is, I can't stand him, but he is absolutely brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. He helped all these dukes. He was a sort of factotum to privileged people, a brain box in the library, looking after the kids. Liberty is the capacity to act or to forbear from acting, which capacity leads naturally to deliberation, which in turn produces a decision, the will to act or not to act. So it's very individual, and it's about simply the capacity to act. And that's liberty, or not act. So for Hobbes, quoting the great Quentin Skinner, we have a natural tendency to do everything we can to preserve our lives. So what do we will our life? How do we act to preserve our life? That's where our liberty is oriented. And so we end up, of course, with the famous remark by Hobbes that because there's more of us than the planet can accommodate, and because we all have liberty, we have got the right to do anything, natural right, one of the first guys ever to think in terms of individual human rights, we end up at grave risk from each other. So liberty produces the guarantee of a life of man as, in his exact phrase, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Quoting Skinner, the desperate paradox on which Hobbes' political theory is grounded is that the greatest enemy of human nature is human nature itself. Which takes you to security. I'll glide over that because most of us know all this. Because liberty puts us at grave risk and puts each of us at grave risk, the solution has to be to mandate a common authority to provide our security. Leviathan. So we end up having submission to a sovereign, and this is a direct quote from Hobbes, to whom we are henceforth to be as absolutely subject as is a child to the father or a slave to the master in the state of nature. Liberty is in fact impossible, so our submission to the protective force of the sovereign is practically absolute. So what starts out as an argument about liberty and human and natural rights ends up as an apology for despotism. And in a famous, not famous, but it's in one of the letters describing his book as, quote, this is Hobbes, a work that now fights on behalf of all kings and all who, under whatever name, hold regal rights. Now, I want you to hold that idea. Liberty is something we all naturally have, but it causes mayhem, and so we hand over power to a state. So we have kind of liberty as long as the state, this is a little key for later, as long as the state doesn't take it away, but the state can take it away. We're naturally free, subject to the state's need to provide security. Now contrast that, around the same time, these amazing progressive guys who are meeting in Putney and are arguing about liberty and security, and they are in revolt against the king, and they're suspicious of Cromwell, and they are thinking about what would life be like if we had liberty and security. But right at the same time, Hobbes is writing in reply to these guys to some extent, and they say, the Levellers, on the 29th of October, 1647, they produce something called an Agreement of the People. And they set out a system of representative government which is responsible, accountable, and democratic. It's an amazing thing. You can get it on the web. And they demand that laws ought to be equal, so they must be good, and not evidently destructive to the safety and the well-being of the people. The safety and the well-being of the people. So here we have a different vision of liberty. We have liberty, not as in, can I do that, can I do this, but liberty as, do I live in a free society? So liberty is a free society. And we have security. I'm slightly over-egging this, but there's other evidence. I'm just choosing this bit as emblematic. Security is not just about not being killed. Security is about, therefore, not only the safety, but also the well-being of the people. Well-being. So security is a rich idea. So for Hobbes, liberal is a very narrow individualistic idea, and security is about not being killed. For the Levellers, liberty is about a freedom in a state, and it's about security as, yeah, not being killed, but also having a good life. Now, these are big, big ideas. And there is this point, are we just talking about England? Well, we're talking about England that spreads to the United States. We're talking about these ideas spreading through the world because of the power of the Anglo-American Leviathan in the centuries after. So the book goes into this, but I'm making a much bigger claim than would appear about the importance of these ideas. Now, here's the sort of kernel of part one. The Levellers seem to have won, but there is a Hobbesian legacy, and it's that Hobbesian legacy that makes bush ground possible. It's a big ask for you to take that on board, but let me just explain it a bit. The levelers were for democracy. We got democracy. The levelers were for a non-spurious rule of law. We have a non-spurious rule of law. We have independent judiciary. We have mass suffrage under democracy. We have regular parliaments. The monarch has very little role, although we've learned recently they do, but leave that to one side. And we have human rights. And human rights itself incorporates all of the others. It's sort of the rule of law, and it's kind of democracy, civil and political rights, and it's also human rights as economic and social rights. So that sounds like liberty and security for all. That sounds the sort of story that would make what Mr. Bush and Mr. Brown say incomprehensible even to them in the context of the laws which they had introduced. But this has not been a perfect victory. The levelers, the democratic, legal, human rights victory has not been complete. The universalist elements of that have not been complete. So the Hobbesian legacy lingers. And let me take you through it. Let's take each of them in turn. The rule of law was already really more or less getting there with Hobbes, so that's the first. The second is democracy, and the third is human rights. Let's see how they play out. Do they deliver liberty and security for all, or do they, anticipating what I'm going to say, deliver liberty and security for the few? Say, take first the rule of law. Well, this is how the rule of law is developed. There's a famous case from 18th century England called Entific and Carrington. Famous case because it asserts the rule of law. And the rule of law is a big deal. If you guys are law students, you know what a big deal it is. You have an independent judiciary, and the executive body has to have the authority of law for its actions. Like we were talking earlier on, David and I, about these monstrous use of drones, totally outside law, to just kill people. But we're pretty sure that if the SAS, or whatever they're called, or the Navy who were meeting you earlier, came in here and killed me, there'd be some potential for legal action. So the rule of law is a big deal. But here's how it comes about. Lord Camden is the guy's name. It's a big case about, we call it now MI5 intrusions. And they denied the government the power to act on the basis of a warrant issued only by the Secretary of State, using modern language. And they said, you can't just come in here and justify searching that guy's property because the minister said it was okay. That's not a warrant. That's a really important point of constitutional principle. The court condemned it. They condemned it because it was an invasion of, we'd say today, privacy. They said property. But then they said, this right to secure our property is preserved sacred and incommunicable in all instances, key bit coming up, where it has not been taken away or abridged by some public law for the good of the whole. So the rule of law is about having a legal sanction for the action, but it's fairly neutral on what the action is. So if we had the Professor Gearty Execution Act, and pursuant to that, the Navy did come in their boats, or the SAS came in and they killed me, that would be in accordance with the rule of law. And so Entific and Carrington is not saying you have rights, it's saying there needs to be a law, and it's not saying no law is possible, it's just saying no law is present here, and laws, moreover, are possible where they are for the good of the whole. Now, this becomes a big thing in English law. There's this guy in the 19th century hanging around Oxford, very anti-Irish guy, anti-woman guy, very right-wing, called Dicey, and he's writing a textbook, and he's a big noise in Oxford, and he's very influential. And he develops this whole theory of law, which is more or less similar, and it's residual. Freedom is residual. This is where Hobbes stays with us. I am free to do whatever I want, like I have a natural right. But the law can stop me, unless the law stops me. So I can walk up and down here because the law doesn't stop me. I am free. Now, the law doesn't stop most of us. The law doesn't stop most of us. So we're free. So we do not experience our life as unfree because we are exercising our residual freedom and the law doesn't step in. And you know, if you're doing first year con law, you know that the police can potentially stop you all the time, but they never do, so you're free. They stop other people, that's the point. They stop other people. Why do they stop other people? This is the second point. This is the second point. What do we mean by democracy? Well, this is where Hobbes and the levelers come together in a fatal conjunction. Democracy should be absolutely about the universal. Is there anything more imaginatively universal than giving everybody the vote? Well, the levelers would say what matters is a free state, not the freedom of the individual within the state. So we have to preserve the free state. And what Hobbes says is Leviathan must be able to do whatever it wants. So each theory empowers a state to act against an individual. And therefore, when the state swoops, deploying its law against an individual, the courts are asking, is this for the public good? And the courts might be Republican in tone, i.e. leveler type, or they might be Leviathan type, but they're saying, is this for the public good? And if the answer to that question is yes, they'll allow it. And so we have some really outstanding examples of this in Britain in history. I picked out a few. My favorite is Mr. Justice Darling. In the First World War, he says, a regulation is okay, and he deploys the legal maxim. David says he loved Latin here in Durham. Salus populi suprema lex. The safety of the people is the supreme law. That's the end of that challenge. Then you have the famous case of Liversidge and Anderson in 1941, where there's detention, and the courts interpret the detention as permitted, even though it was manifest on the language that it wasn't, and they deploy the same kind of reasoning about the safety of the state. This is where you find the exercise of discretion by the state is what's crucial. If they don't exercise discretion against you, you're free. You experience life as free. If they exercise discretion against you, wham, you have very few defenses. I first came across this in 19th century cases. All the human rights people and all those people used to make a big deal about a case to do with the Salvation Army, and of all places, Weston-super-Mare. Oh, the allowed march, isn't that wonderful? Fantastic. Oh my goodness, isn't that amazing? Dicey wrote a whole chapter about how wonderful they are. And the same year, a bunch of Orange fanatics were disrupting a meeting of the Land League in Northern Ireland, and the police or magistrates, or whatever there was in those days, decided to disperse the Land League. And they said, well, you can't have a meeting because look at those orange men, they're going to beat you up. And the Land League said, well, stop the orange men. And so somebody heard about Beattie and Gilbanks, this case on the Salvation Army, and they got all excited, and they took it to the court in Dublin. And the court, Dublin, that was part of the United Kingdom, if you remember at that time. And the court said, oh, we don't understand that Beattie and Gilbanks case. Of course you have to stop the Land League. Time after time after time, it's an evaluation of the threat which determines the outcome of the case. So you have the communists in the 1920s and 30s, they can do nothing. They can't even hire a hall. When they have a place in South Wales, the police burst in and arrest them. They have a meeting outside an unemployment exchange. They're arrested. All they're doing is talking. All of this is upheld, upheld, upheld. The safety of the state, the safety of the state. But it's not happening to people who are not challenging the state. It's a magnificent case in 1926 or 27, the Home Secretary defending a decision to prosecute the Communist Party members for sedition describes in Parliament how they were engaged in the wrong kind of speech. He said, we are totally committed to free speech. We're a free country. This is a country that glorifies liberty. But this was the wrong speech. 1930s, all the police breaking up of the left and hunger marches. And when the Mosleyites were marching, they all recalled they're the English Defence League of the time. They recalled their commitment to civil liberties. And they protect them, and everybody's talking about how important free speech is. Right wing speech like that, apart from being broadly supported by the police, which is a big issue in the 1930s, doesn't challenge the state in any kind of radical way. So it allows the state to reaffirm its vision of itself as free. Exactly the same thing happened before that dreadful Norwegian killed those people in Norway. The English Defence League was being defended by Eric Pickles at the same time as they were prosecuting Muslims for disrupting commemoration services for forces returning from Afghanistan. You know, there was totally lacking even-handedness. And Pickles was there talking about the importance of the British tradition of liberty, which means that, like them or not, we have to allow the EDL. And it was only when Breivik killed all those people in Norway that they went ahead with the ban. Now, there's two illusions. The golden age in the past is the idea that there was this age of universal liberty. There never was. There was liberty for those who didn't challenge the system, and there was danger for those who did. That's exactly the same with the so-called golden age in the present. There is danger if you step outside too much. Now, fortunately, in this country, I don't mean by danger torture within the jurisdiction. I have to amend that, of course, and say that I do mean torture outside the jurisdiction, because there's now irrefutable evidence that the British forces were engaged in systemic torture in southern Iraq, and have always been. But I mean within the jurisdiction. Since Northern Ireland, they don't torture. And apart from Northern Ireland, they don't kill. You're broadly speaking not likely to be killed by the security forces in England and Wales, so you might be in Northern Ireland. However, you will find yourself disrupted. So you will not experience this culture as free, but that will not stop lots and lots and lots of other people experiencing it as completely free. Human rights is the third bulwark of universalism. And human rights seems immediately to be very universalist in terms of absolutely, by definition, covering everybody. And in law, it does. In law, all the treaties, the obligations, the ICC this and the ICESC that, and all the things I don't fully understand, but the international lawyers in the front row here will explain to us. But remember, Holmes, the risk of rights is destruction. And there is a different version of human rights, which is that human rights is not actually about individuals, it's about values. And we are, as a country, free, we're committed to the rule of law, democracy, and human rights, and that's not just this or that treaty, and moreover, we're under attack, Gordon Brown. We're under attack. And so we will be destroyed, we have to fight back. So human rights becomes a reason for violence. Both violence in other countries, we have to invade these places in order to protect us from those violent people, in order to preserve our human rights, or people within the jurisdiction who challenge us. There's a government strategy on this, rewritten by the Conservative Party to attack speech within the jurisdiction which, though lawful, challenges British values. And one of the British values, paradoxically and ironically, is a respect for freedom of speech. So in the name of a respect for freedom of speech, we won't let some people speak. Israel is a past master of deploying this language of human rights. It's not to do with the treaties, none of which they'll belong to. It's to do with the kind of culture which they say renders them more American or European and allows them to act in a way which to any natural observer or normal observer, non-partisan observer, would look like mass killing. It's not mass killing, it's defending ourselves from those who would destroy our human rights. There are some intellectuals who have done that too. The chap who tried to become Prime Minister of Canada, Michael Ignatieff, did that in a book which was called The Lesser Evil. That's the end of the past. That's the longest bit and the hardest bit. The rest we can rattle through because you know it quite well. What's the upsum from that? It's absolutely inherent in the way we look at the world in this country and elsewhere is the idea that liberty and security are for all, but in practice are not for all. They're for those who don't rock the boat. Now today, this has become a lot more serious recently. And I dated to, without confidence, and I took all this out of the book, I think it's connected up to neoliberalism and the defeat of communism in 1989 and the triumph of individualism, capitalism, and the market, with the inevitable consequence that there are grotesque disparities of wealth between the winners and the losers. And therefore we have to write out of the script equality of outcome and certainly even equality of opportunity. And what it's given rise to is this concept I've got in this book, which I'm going to push of the neo-democratic state. Let me tell you what I mean by that. I don't mean just a bunch of weird places you never heard of that are now called democracies. I mean each of them. I mean the old democracies, the new democracies, and the United Nations, all three. The old democracies are dressing down, and the new democracies are dressing up, and the UN is turning itself into an agent for the prevention of terrorism, not for the promotion of human rights. Each of them very briefly. All democracies dressing down. Well, we're all raving about Mr. Obama's second inaugural speech. He didn't mention Guantanamo, did he? They have institutionalized detention without trial. They've put in a few more of these special advocates. They have a few more doctors. They'd sort of like to try them, but it's now part of the scene. It is surviving and coming out stronger after the most liberal American president since Roosevelt. In Britain, we have terrorism laws, which are absolutely bedded down. We have terrorism prevention investigation measures, and we had outrageous proposals for secret justice to cover up the fact of torture, which will get through, but have been slightly modified. Now, the old democracies are preserving their traditional commitment to freedom, to liberty and security for some, but not for all. Because these policies I've mentioned, Guantanamo, secret justice, TPIMs, terrorism laws, we do not believe they'll apply to us. We think they'll apply to other people. And those other people will be either not British, or they'll be British, stroke, or not American, or they'll be not British, they'll be British or American with funny names. And so what you see time and time again is these laws are deployed against not us people. And every now and again you get a glimpse of how it works. Mainly it's somebody whose name I haven't got here and won't try and recall, an American who's killed in the Middle East. He doesn't sound like an American, though he is an American, so we just kill him. All the people being held under control orders at the end were British, but they never released the names. They never released the names. So we don't know, but we can guess who they were. They're Muslim British. Every now and again, the cover is broken. There was a chap called Brandon Mayfield who was arrested after the explosions in Madrid in America, and he had converted to Islam, so he was believed to be responsible for it. But his name was Brandon Mayfield. And he was released. It was obvious he hadn't done it. He got paid $2 million compensation by the FBI. You know. And an outstanding example of the them and us is the Secretary of State, Theresa May, Gary McKinnon, the chap whom they didn't send back to America, she's committed to human rights completely. Gary McKinnon, with his nice mom, Mrs. McKinnon. And Gary could be you or me. Gary's the guy in the room who cracks the computer. He feels British. So we have a commitment to all these things, human rights, rule of law. But you remember the South American with the cat? Theresa May, I'm not making this up, though it turned out she was, about the South American asylum seeker who had to be kicked out and that the courts were scandalously allowing him to remain because he bonded with his cat. The story there was about this person not being British. And there was a quote from some guys who were alleged, we have to be careful about all the defamation here, but the filming won't go straight out, will it? Do you remember the guys, the Nat West 3, whatever they're called, one of these guys? Every now and again, people like us do really, really sort of potentially suspicious things, and other countries want them. And they give interviews about how this is a breach of human rights. And then one of them, I remember which one, not one of the NatWest 3, the guy I think wanted for supplying Iran, said they're using laws, against me when Abu Hamza's walking the streets or something. So he made almost explicit that, these laws aren't for me, these laws are for other people. That's what we believe. That's dressing down. That's dressing down. We all experience liberty the way Bush and Brown tell us, but we don't have any feel for the way it's experienced by those other people who want radically to rock the boat, who want to rethink how we are. New democracies is an even sadder story, and I go into it at length in a whole chapter in the book. Basically, these countries have realized you can be democracy and you can deliver prosperity for the few, and as long as the many don't disturb the system, they won't be killed, but if they disturb the system, they will. And this is what you do. You have a constitution which you put on the web, and you have as many human rights as you can think of. You can have human rights for trees, for all I care. You put as much in as possible. Then you subscribe to all human rights treaties you can, including all regional ones. You try and become on the committee, like Bahrain was. You invite in as many monitors as you can. You have a tremendous number of local human rights monitors. I think that the Human Rights UN Commissioner, or was it the Commissioner from Europe, when he or she visited Russia, they met 60 Russian human rights monitors. You know, I mean, that's slightly over the top. And you subscribe to whatever judicial proceedings can oversee you, and then you ignore it all. You invade a member country of the Council of Europe if you feel like it, Russia. You send a chap over with some explosives to kill another chap, Russia. You, in Hungary, impose compulsory retirement age on judges at 62 because you don't like their judgments, and you're still in the European Union. Turkey, the same. And they've cracked it. It's a dressing up of in the garb of democracy. And as long as you, as a member of those countries, as long as you don't become an investigative journalist, as long as you don't protest, as long as you don't give interviews to the foreign press, you're not going to be killed. You will experience freedom. It will not be like the Soviet period. You will have liberty, but it will be at a price. And those who do this will be outside and will be disrupted. And so I'm saying that the old democracies have made this kind of world possible by their own shabby compromises on freedom. And the new democracies are availing of it. And there's a new word for neo-democracy. And the United Nations is the same. The United Nations is the same. I mean, you know, they've introduced these blacklists, they've introduced these UN Security Council that set up this counterterrorism committee, there's an executive directorate, they have these UN experts who visit countries, and they criticize countries for failing to comply with the terrorism provisions of the United Nations Security Council. Security Council, this is just a bunch of countries that have self-selected. There's no democratic mandate. And even the constitution of the country is not sufficient an excuse for non-compliance with the terrorism law. So it's turned the UN on its head. Slightly exaggerated. There's been some compromise. But compromise confirms a system in place. There's now some sort of ombudsperson who's a kind of nice Canadian. And that nice Canadian will say, please, please, please don't do it. And they'll say, we hear what you're saying, and do it. That's called process. Or they'll send a nice letter. I'm exaggerating. Fiona knows all about this. I'm exaggerating slightly. They'll send a nice letter as opposed to no letter. That's neo-democracy. Or they'll allow you to appeal. They'll tell you you're on the list, and you'll write back and say, I'm terribly sorry, I'm dead. That used to happen quite a lot at the store. Now, I'm winding down. And I've got loads of time. Can I tell a few jokes? No, I'm nearly finished. I'm actually on the future. So I've got to the third bit. I honestly don't know. I think it's really interesting time where we are with this, because I think we could go in either of two directions. This neo-democracy could become so normal that we forget what it's like to have genuine commitment to democracy. By which I mean, it'll be generally accepted that, broadly speaking, Francis Fukuyama was right, and that we are at the end of history, and it'll be generally accepted that there is just one system. I mean, austerity is interesting, because we seem to have all assumed that is the only option, really. And we maintain all the forms of liberty and security for all, democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, but they'll be qualified in practice, and they'll be sort of shells. And we'll keep them because we want to believe that we're good as well as rich. And, you know, rich people get to define ethics as well as lifestyle. Or we'll actually re-energize our understanding of what liberty and security mean. And again, austerity is a good example, because I think it's got people thinking about how little they control any of the outcomes that really matter to their own lives, even though they're supposedly living in democratic countries. And there are people who do this work, really good people. I think some of the human rights monitors whom I was mildly lampooning have been fantastic. I think Martin Scheiner was a fantastic guy. He was the Human Rights Commissioner on Terrorism for the UN, and he took on a lot of the assumptions at the UN level. I think this guy, Dick Marty, has been doing great work at whatever parliament it is he is in, the European Parliament thing, or the Council of Assembly thing, isn't it? Sorry, I'm vague on They've got details. The judges have been terrific, actually, because I'll tell you why judges have been terrific. Judges kind of take words seriously. So when they're told the system is one that guarantees liberty, they sort of believe it, and they are dominated by text. And so in a lot of countries, you've had, interventions by judges. The United States Supreme Court in Boumediene and other cases, it hasn't been a left-right divide. They say, oh, the rule of law really matters, so you can't have these people held without charge. You need some statutory mandate. The United Kingdom, the best case under the Human Rights Act is the Belmarsh case, where the judges said, look, you can't enact a Human Rights Act and then lock all these foreigners up. That's silly, because the Human Rights Act is actually about humans. Now, parenthetically, one of the members of the British Bill of Rights Commission just reported wants special rights for Brits, less good rights for Europeans, and really nasty rights for the rest. He's actually made it explicit, Martin Howe QC. So interesting to have an argument about that, but we prefer it not to be explicit. Judges take it seriously. The European Court of Justice in the case of Qadi and the European Court of Human Rights in the case of NADA have actually said to the UN, sorry, we know you're a universal body, but keep out of our space. Do not impose your swinging, unaccountable decisions on people within our jurisdictions. So there's been movement there. The hardest of all, at the moment, is democratic. It's really tricky. And the reason it's really tricky is because of something else, which is what I called in one of the books I did on terrorism, the politics of the next atrocity. It is extremely risky for a politician to take liberal action in the world of terrorism law because a subsequent terrorism attack could be laid at his or her door. I am convinced the reason that President Obama has not closed Guantanamo is because he would end up with some ex-detainees in Guantanamo in the United States. And if one of them so much as picked up a gun and went to a shopping mall, or much less engaged in some politically violent act, that would be the end of the Obama presidency. And I'm pretty sure it's been a raw political calculation, which is why he has reversed himself. It was the same, I believe, with Tony Blair. Tony Blair went for 90-day detention. It didn't matter, I think, whether it was 100-day or 100-year or 1,000-year. He knew it wouldn't be passed. He was insuring himself, in my opinion, against an atrocity in the run-up to an election. Because there'd been an atrocity in Madrid, and it had cost the government power. And he wanted to be able to go on telly on the night of the atrocity and say, I tried to get detention, but it wouldn't work. It's really, really difficult for democratic politicians to defeat the politics of the next atrocity. Even the Lib Dems, who came into power with a very strong liberal agenda, they got rid of control orders, but they replaced them with terrorism prevention investigation measures. Now, there are some successes in the margins, but they did replace them. So I think we need to try and create a culture where it's possible for a political leader to eschew opportunism. And actually, my very last point, as it happens, that is often the responsibility of the opposition. If the opposition in a country could somehow signal that they were not going to blame a political community that was in power, irrationally and illogically, but politically effectively blame a political party in power for some atrocity that follows their removal of terrorism laws, if there could be some degree of bipartisanship about that, then I think we'd make progress. Ed Miliband offered that at some point, but I'm afraid his home team appeared to have been happier to say of even modest reforms to our current terrorism laws that they put Britain at risk. And as long as politicians are prepared to say that, no politician in power will risk the change. Thank you, David. That's it.
Great. Questions. But before we have questions, let me exploit my position and ask you three, just for clarification. The first is a question about Hobbes. You portray Hobbes as an absolutist figure in many respects, and your arguments turn on that. And yet I think there's also a powerful strand in Leviathan that says that the sovereign is legitimate if and only if it is not just security that is maintained, but a commodious life. And if you unpack the meaning of a commodious life, it's not 100 million miles away from some of the levelers' arguments. Secondly, the Hobbesian legacy, it's crucial to your argument that it lingers. And the Hobbesian legacy is that liberty requires security above all. And this gives rise to you to characterize, as it were, the neo-democratic state as liberty for those who don't challenge the state and no liberty for those that do. But that conceptual distinction runs into a lot of problems because with it, one can't really distinguish between Britain, Putin's Russia, and Gaddafi's Libya. Because one could well argue that Putin and Gaddafi held exactly the same view as the British government, which is liberty is fine in Gaddafi's Libya, as long as you don't oppose him. And indeed, there were quite advanced commitments to freedom of speech, but not freedom of assembly, of course. So too in Putin's Russia. But there is a necessity for some finer distinctions. Otherwise, we can't distinguish these different kinds of fundamentally, in my view, different countries and regimes. A third and final point is the counterfactual to your critique, which is well taken, by the way, certainly by me, and we're on the same page on this, of neo-democracies. The counterfactual is some kind of claim that there is an alternative to this, a compelling democratic cultural alternative to this. And then you give a hint, a culture that eschews optimism, eschews opportunism, is the point. But the problem with democracy, in my view, is greater than that. Democracy has a sort of, in my judgment, a Shakespeareanly tragic element, and that is it's inherently short-termist. Election cycles are every 4 years. Democratic clashes are about the median voter, not about stark differences at the extremes. They can assume what the electorate thinks at both ends, but it's about the median voter. And democracies are inherently inward-looking and not outward-looking beyond their borders in many respects, because it's the median voter the floating voter you have to please. So these are three questions. Question about Hobbes, how far your characterization is right. The second question is about, does your conceptual machine give you enough capacity to draw distinctions one might want to make? And the third one is the counterfactual plausible? Thank you. I'll just let him get on with that before we move on.
I won't take too long dealing with those. And on one occasion, he asked me 10 in a row. So I've got off light with 3. I'll be quick though, David, because we want to involve the audience. On the first, there is a big discussion about whether Hobbes qualified his sovereign in any way, whether or not we retained any kind of residual rights to reject the sovereign. It's well known that Locke, writing later, saw that as quite an important aspect because he was trying to justify, or was seen later to be trying to justify removal of a sovereign. And it depends how you read it. And Hobbes has survived partly because he is kind of slightly ambiguous. But it's, in my opinion, and the opinion of some of the guys that know more about Hobbes than me, it's quite hard to read Hobbes as qualified in his commitment to the sovereign power on something to do with judgments about commodious living. And then I'd go even further and say it's really hard to see how a scheme survives qualified support, because in a sense it depends on, he's so dramatic about the dangers of liberty on wholesale transfer. But, he's written a lot, and he takes different bits separately. On the second, it's really an important one, and I think as I was expressing it here and writing it, I'm close to sounding as though I'm saying they're all the same. And it's manifestly absurd. Absolutely. But what I will say is that there are movements from some countries in the direction of what could become quite a dodgy approach to democracy if we're not careful. And a movement which changed the names of the place and changed the names of the actors would look quite like Putin's Russia. The government's proposals for secret justice, which were modified, to which I alluded, were not far off what Stalin might have thought of, actually, albeit, an extreme example. You make an allegation of having been tortured by the secret services, and suddenly the case is secret, and you don't have a lawyer, and there are representations made to the court, almost certainly a security check judge, in your absence. That's quite a tricky thing to defend. Now, it's not on, and I've exaggerated what was proposed, but don't be too confident that all of what goes on here is as good as we think it is. Having said that, the other risk is I sound as though I'm contemptuous of the efforts by the human rights community and the UN to modify the conduct of the Russias and the Hungaries and the Turkeys of this world. And I don't know if I am. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. Are these commissioners worth it? Others who will know more about this can comment. Having read a lot of these reports, I've noticed a recent tendency, which is to congratulate the country on the level of access the visitors have had, and then the agreement to differ on the substantive issues, often under cover of the war on terror. And I just hope that monitors are not satisfied simply with having met senior figures. On the third point, which you, for me, gratifyingly picked up my point about the future, something other than short-termism is possible. It's easier in Britain, I think, than it is in the United States, on which I'll say something in a moment. But we had actually cross-party consensus on big issues which were really serious in this country for many years. For example, Northern Ireland. And it gave government freedom of manoeuvre. It happened in back channels, and it enabled government to take risks about talking to terrorists, inverted commas, without the destruction of the government. And Labour did not use its undoubted capacity to destroy Patrick Mayhew when it became apparent that they were talking to the IRA. And when John Major had said it would turn his stomach to talk to the IRA, and it turned out he was, they didn't go for it. And so bipartisanship on really important issues is possible. And a speech by the Labour Party as the current opposition, which said, we have too many illiberal laws in this country, we're partly responsible for it, and if there's going to be cross-party agreement on the removal of some laws, send signals across the House that if there's a bomb, they won't turn up in the studio saying it's because we removed the laws. Absurd, but they need to resist the temptation. America's much harder. The Republican Party is irrational. It may, however, be returning to some level of rationality. And wouldn't it be a remarkable thing if the opinion formers in the Republican Party made a speech saying how Guantanamo is an affront to American political tradition, and that properly policed, they are confident that the excellent forces for security in the United States would manage the integration within American society of the people who've been held without charge for so long in this military facility. If we don't argue for that, we give up on imagining a better future.
Well, it just then remains for me to thank you all, and thank Conor in particular. Passionate, yes, but not all. Witty, yes, but not all. Astute, great addition, and engaged, and fundamentally engaged. So I thought it was a fantastic evening with you, Conor. I think we all thoroughly enjoyed it. It gives a huge amount to think about and to follow up in your text. So Conor should be getting 50, 60 emails tomorrow asking for an author discount. And that's all you're getting anyway, not from discount from the publisher. And so thank you very much, Conor. It was a really, really engaging evening.